Hey guys, this is handcrafted by Jason Cooper. I'm in my garage today and I wanted to show you something, a small project that I built here recently that I'm really glad I did. It's been very useful. Before I get into that, just be sure to subscribe to this channel. Stop by my website at woodwork.cooperjason.com and subscribe to my email list, or however you want to find me on social media. All those links are in the description below. The project was a crosscut sled for my miter or for my table saw. I had this table saw for years, nice good sized table saw. It's been great, it's fantastic. It's a rigid table saw. I got it at Home Depot. And I've seen everybody build these crosscut sleds for their table saws and just think, man, someday I need to do that. Well, I got to looking around my shop a couple weeks ago and I realized I had a perfect piece of plywood to make the base for this. And so let me show you what I did, how I built it, and how it all came together. All right, there it is, my massive crosscut sled for my table saw. Like I said, I realized that I had a piece of, this is 1/2-inch Baltic birch plywood that I had left over from some cabinet work I did earlier this year, and I thought, man, that'll be perfect. It's about the exact same size as my tabletop on my table saw, and all I had to do was make a couple pieces for the front edge and the back edge and have a simple crosscut sled ready to go. Now there's tons of videos out there about building a crosscut sled, and I didn't record the process of actually building it, but I wanted to show you some of the things about it. Because if you go watch those videos, there's all sorts of extra things they do, including T-tracks and stuff on the this end, so they can put adjustable stop blocks and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's great, but if if that stuff starts to overwhelm you thinking about, how do I get the most out of this? You end up not building something because it's just too complicated and you want to make sure you get it right. The reality is, this is all made from scrap wood. It didn't cost me a dime extra. I didn't have to order any special parts, T-track, any of that kind of stuff. And I've got a very useful sled. So what it is, again, 1/2-inch Baltic birch that's a little bit bigger than the top of my saw. And that's, it could actually be a little smaller. That's fine for yours, however you want to build it. But whatever you do, build one, because they are fantastic. So I started with the piece of plywood. I cut some scrap plywood. This is about 4 inches tall. And the reason I use the 1/2-inch here is because if you use 3/4, that's just more depth that you're not going to be able to use on your saw blade when you need to use it, because you're losing that, it only raised up so far. And if you want to kind of maximize it, I would just use 1/2-inch. Baltic birch is a good choice because it's nice and stable, nice and flat, and no voids and all that kind of stuff. So the rest of it, though, are just scrap pieces of plywood. I cut them into, like I said, this is about 4 inches tall. Tall enough that it'll be, I'll never cut through it with my saw blade. So that stabilizes this end. And this piece is actually a little taller, but again, it was just scrap. 2 pieces glued together. Glue them together, clamp them up. That one does not need to be as long. It just needs to be able to span that joint and get a couple screws on each side to stabilize it. This one you might want to be a little longer because you might have longer pieces you're working with. Mine's not quite as long as or quite as wide as the base itself, but it is there. Like most people, I cut a little chamfer in the bottom edge so that sawdust that's on there doesn't get in the way when you put a piece in and slide it up against there. It doesn't wedge in between there and throw off the cut just a little bit. But, I find that I end up blowing the dust off of this a lot just to make sure I get a good clean cut. So you take your base piece, you cut a couple of pieces for your miter slots that are nice and tight. You want them to be nice and tight. I had a piece of maple that I was able to just plane down so it fit in the slot nice and firm, and then cut strips off of that were just a little bit shallower, not quite as thick as the depth of the miter slot, so that there was plenty of room to move it along there. It wouldn't bind up on the bottom here at any point. So I cut those, laid them in the slot, actually put some washers down in the slot to raise it up just a little bit so the top edge of that runner was above the tabletop. You could use pennies or whatever you want to do, just something in there all the way along. Laid them down. I actually used painter's tape on both sides just to keep the excess glue from getting on the tabletop and having to worry about that. Just peel it up and throw it away instead of having to scrape it off the top. But put those in there on top of the washers, applied glue to them, and then using my fence as best I could, I set that to the edge there where it would square up the base piece, and then carefully laid that down on there. Put something heavy on it. In my case, it was my planer. Set it on top of there. Let the glue dry for at least, half hour, hour or so overnight if you want to, before you peel it back up. Once you do that, flip it over, countersink some screws along the runners on the bottom of this. Screw them down so they won't move. And then give it a shot. Try it in your slots, flip it back over, and see if it moves okay. If it's a little tight, you can put a little draw some pencil lead down the side or a marker, and run it through a few times like this without the blade. This is before I cut the slot, to figure out where the tight spots were. Sand them a little bit or whatever you can do to make it move smoothly. Put some paste wax on them so they'll slide nice. Okay, so once you have your runners on your base, then you're going to apply your fences. That fence is easy because it doesn't have to be square. It just needs to be on there to stabilize it across there, because you're not going to use that for anything but stabilizing that end of the jig. This one, on the other hand, you have to get as square as possible. So what you do is you get your one end attached, the far end. You set this in place with the saw blade all the way down. Then you're going to turn on your saw and slowly raise up the saw blade till it peeks through somewhere around that end there. Then you're going to cut your base piece almost to the end, not all the way, but almost to where you're within a couple inches of the end, and you're going to stop. Pull it back, and then you're going to use that line to set this in place and square it up as best you can with a carpenter's square or some other square you have. And then you're going to drive a screw from the bottom side in one end and hold that in place. Double check for square. Come to the other end, drive a screw from the bottom in place. And now you've got at least 2 screws holding it, and you're going to do a test piece. And I recommend the 5-cut method. I did not record that. There's plenty of videos out there on how to do that, to test for square. Make your adjustments and get this as square as possible, because this is where the money is. This is what makes it so useful, is that this cut is going to be within maybe a couple thousandths of an inch of square, and that is amazing. Way better than you can usually get with your miter gauge itself. So you're going to do that. Once you get this perfectly square, then you're going to add some additional screws. You got one on the end, probably one in here close to the center, and at least one in the middle, maybe 2 in the middle. Same thing on this side. And you have your crosscut sled. You're going to make a relief cut in the fence itself, and then this thing becomes a highly useful tool. Some people will put a couple extra pieces on this outside so the blade never actually comes through. It's a great idea. I might add that at some point. But the point is, build yourself a sled. Don't worry about adding all the extras at this point. Just get one done, because they are so useful. The best part is when you go to cut something, you can make your mark on the piece. And I don't have a mark here, but make your mark on the piece where you want to cut. And all you have to do is line it up with the relief cut from your saw blade, and you will get a perfect cut every time. And for pieces that aren't real long and repeated cuts, clamp a stop block on, get it to where you need it, clamp that stop block in place, make the first cut, take it out, put another piece in, make the next cut just like you would any other stop block operation you're doing on a miter saw or something like that. It just makes using your table saw so much easier. But again, the point is, you probably have enough scrap lying around that you can make this happen certainly in a couple of hours. Probably takes longer for the glue to dry than to make the rest of the sled. Take your time squaring up the fence, and you will have a wonderful table saw sled, crosscut sled, that you can use all the time. And believe me, I use it all the time. So that's it. Again, look up a couple other videos on how to build these things. That's what I did. Got some good ideas, but the point is, just get it done. Don't worry about all the extras unless you really want to. Don't let that slow you down. Build your sled, and you won't regret it. Okay? Till next time, this is Handcrafted by Jason Cooper. See ya.